Thank you all for joining us today for this will be week 7 of the Capital Connection series in our 7th week of the legislature, the 25th 2025 legislative session. I'm Sheridan Hoyer. I'm joined here with Todd O'Hare, our president and CEO. I serve as the government relations specialist, and I'll start with a little bit of an update from last week, and we will jump right into everything happening here at the legislature. I'm sure you've heard a little bit about it. So last week was pretty smooth sailing. We had quite a bit of snow, but life was good. Our TIF bills are mostly soaring through, lots of little refinements around the edges of tax increment financing to ensure that they can remain as a tool for development use. Senate Bill 2 is the one that's still kind of hung up, and we'll keep you posted on that. But Senate Bills 1, 3, House Bill 19, and some others are moving right along. We heard those last week. The two big property tax bills were heard in appropriations last week, so that means they've made it through House taxation, made it through a vote on the floor, and then were heard in House appropriations. And so that is House Bill 231, which is the governor's property tax task force bill, and then House Bill 155, which is kind of the Democratic response or Democratic version of that bill. And no action has been taken on those yet. They had some good hearings, and we stayed out of those last week. We did oppose them in House taxation, but we are mostly concerned with the bifurcated tax system that they create. If you start taxing commercial property at two different rates, then the ability to just keep jacking up that higher class of property and keep jacking up that rate is a lot easier than if it does not exist as two separate tax classes to begin with. Anything else to add on the property tax front there, Todd?
No, I think you covered that well. And if we've got some additional questions as we get towards the end, we can cover it. I think you covered that well, Sheridan.
Great. We did go in, there's been a lot less housing legislation than I think we expected. A lot of it comes down to we have been focused on the supply side of the equation and some zoning things, but not some of the zoning bills haven't been large enough to really do a whole lot. And in talking with some of our local government allies in that regard, it doesn't really make much of a difference to what they're already doing. So mostly we're staying out, but we did support House Bill 422, which would allow a covenant to provide housing affordability. So if you own a space or a building that is only for workforce housing, say if you have a ski hill and you built an apartment complex, but you want to sell the apartment complex, but you want to ensure that it remains for workforce housing for those seasonal workers, you can create a covenant in that so that remains as workforce housing. And that was not a requirement by anyone, but it just is another way to allow that an easier way with some of the systems. Currently, they have to use like ground leases and different terms in that way. So this was just another way for property owners to ensure that their property, it's in the same section of code as conservation easements, things like that. And then we got to support some things in the workforce education bucket. We had a bill that would allow for educational credit for students who are volunteering in nursing homes, long-term care, or child care facilities. And then also a bill to support middle school career and technical education, so funding for career and technical education at the middle school level. So lots of things happening last week. The biggest news is that just yesterday, House Bill 245, that's Ed Betry's Medicaid bill, that's the one that survived the House, and it was transmitted to the Senate. We weren't sure when it was going to be assigned and scheduled in a committee, but they moved real quick on it. It was heard yesterday in Senate Public Health, and a long hearing, a good hearing, and then they recessed and immediately took executive action, and it did make it out of committee on a 6-5 vote. And kind of talk had been that like the Senate committee would be where we might struggle to get that across the finish line. And so good news there, a bit of surprising news, but not one that we're going to complain about.
No, I think that's right. And some of it is the passage of Medicaid expansion renewal out of the Senate committee. some of it may be attributed to some of the turmoil that you hear about that's going on amongst Senate Republicans and Democrats over on the Senate side. And so, like, we're doing our best to stay out of that internal fight and disagreement that's going on. But as Sheridan noted, we'd always kind of figured that the Senate committee that Medicaid expansion was going to hear was going to be the most challenging part of moving that along. So that being one of our top priorities, if not our number one priority, feels like that's good movement as that moves forward. This week and next week are going to be big crunch periods of time because we're running up against what they call transmittal, which is the official halfway point of the legislative session. And at that halfway point, with some exceptions for some different sort of revenue bills and tax-related bills, some of those sort of things, every bill has to make it from one chamber over to the next chamber. If it doesn't, then it dies automatically. And so there is a massive crush that is started and is going to ramp up over the course of the next 2.5 weeks to get bills passed from one chamber over to the next chamber before we run into that hard deadline of the transmittal break, which is, I think, the 5th of March, 6th of March, something like 7th of March, right? So that's the official halfway point. And so there's a big crush that's going on. There's lots of hearings that are going on. Now, I'm just kind of looking through our list. There's a lot of workmen's compensation related bills that are being heard this week. There's some additional childcare related hearings this week that we're looking at. And then the 17th. Then there's some continued Montana Environmental Policy Act sort of bills that we're moving through the session. And we've really been engaged in Montana Environmental Policy or Montana Environmental Policy Act, MEPA. We've been really engaged in those because that's the process by which a lot of state permits, particularly permits related to natural resource development, have to go through a MEPA process. So we've really been engaged in those bills to make sure that we have a process, or to try to get to a process that is more predictable once an investor or a developer moves down that road, that they have some level of certainty of, like, this is what the path is going to look like. And when you get to the end of this sort of process, you either get a yes or a no. It's not drug out again for extra years for additional analysis and contemplation and hand wringing and that sort of thing. So we've been involved in a number of those sort of bills as it relates to MEPA. What is there anything else, Sheridan, that you can think of that I might not have hit on?
I'll add a couple little points, just that as we talk MEPA, there's been a couple different bills on energy, whether it's reliability or generation or things like that. And we're just making sure that we take stances that reflect our all of the above legislative stance, and that we shouldn't be requiring any specific type of energy generation, because we know that, I think, especially as it continues to snow, we are reminded of how important that is, and that we need to have backups on backups and things like that. And so just making sure that is there. There is a bill, a banking bill up, if you're related to that, on equality in financial services. That's SB 240, that we're just concerned would stifle the ability of banks to make decisions that are good for their business. It introduces language on non-discrimination for kind of social causes, but Todd made a good point when we were chatting about it earlier, that when you go into nearly every other type of restaurant or other establishment, they reserve the right to refuse service to anyone at any time. And it's not exactly the same in banking, but they should be allowed to make those decisions for what's right for their business. Or maybe on the opposite direction, if they don't specialize in ag lending, but I'm a farmer that wants to go in, they should be allowed to tell me why, right? And they can make that decision. And then on the childcare bills, There are 4 up this week. I'll chat a little bit more on that. I'm hoping to have things up in our at least by tomorrow on our webpage. So I just put that in the chat. It doesn't actually a link, so you have to copy and paste that into your browser. But if you go to montanachamber.com on our advocacy page, we do have a way to get involved. So if you fill that out, you'll get our alerts for how to take action on specific bills. We thought we might need to really use it for Medicaid, but we'll see what that looks like now. And a couple of those bills deal with licensing, which the biggest concern there is that any changes to the proposed rules that the Department of Health and Human Services worked on in the interim would be negated, and so those would not go into effect. And we think that those did a really good job of being holistic in their approach and emphasizing the ability of child cares to read the rules, understand them quickly, and get into business, stay in business, be able to follow the rules, whereas this would do wouldn't be quite in the same way, right? Wouldn't be quite aligned in that same way. And we think it isn't red tape relief, to use the governor's term. And then a couple of bills that would change the scholarship program. The Best Beginnings is the federal child care subsidy program. And one of those bills that we'll be supporting, both of them, one of those bills would change the eligibility from 185% of federal poverty level to a percent of state median income. And so that just makes it a little bit more tailored to Montana and what Montana families are making and can provide. And then the other one would automatically allow childcare workers to be eligible for childcare subsidies. So that's helping anybody who works in a childcare facility get their childcare paid for, which we think would be a good retention tool in keeping folks employed in childcare, because we know that burnout is so high. So that's a lot of details, but that's my update.
And I'll just, on a general sort of observation note, I'll offer a couple of points. Is that the division that exists within the Senate is more than just a side distraction. It does have implications for bills because, and it does have implications for us, and we're evaluating what those implications are all the time. It's become very personal for those folks and the division that's going on there. There's some really hard feelings that are being further exacerbated, I guess would be a good way to put it. And so it creates an additional sort of challenge for us to navigate that ongoing sort of rift in the Senate. The Senate is, I think it's safe to say, is behind schedule. The House seems to be operating pretty efficiently and is moving along pretty in a, I would say, largely on track sort of tempo. I think the Senate is behind, and so there's a big crush that's coming there. On taxes, I would say that, we spent a little bit of time talking about whether or not the chamber should take a position when it comes to local option sales tax. And we ultimately decided, like, we're not going to. There's a number of sales tax sort of bills that have been introduced or are going to be introduced. Those probably won't have to meet the transmittal deadline sort of parameters, so they could come later because they're revenue related sort of bills. At some point, and you've heard me say this before, we're going to have a more serious conversation about what Montana's tax structure looks like, because as we're going through this legislative session, we're tinkering around with property taxes by creating different classes within existing property tax, within commercial and within residential. There's conversations about different sorts of sales taxes and local options taxes. I don't know what's going to come of all of it. And some of it is likely to be dictated to some extent by some of the rift that we see going on in the Senate. So there's a lot of turmoil, and this does have, despite the fact that you read it and you might like shake your head or giggle about it, it's more than just a side distraction. It does have pretty broad sort of implications on policy for a lot of folks. And so we're doing the best that we can to navigate this set of uncertain circumstances that we're dealing with because you don't know where all the sort of blowback might occur through a legislative session.